An exciting new track, but not an exciting race. Unless you're a Dutch fan, of course. This race would have been fantastic for you, which we could tell from all the orange smoke we saw on TV. It's now time to get into the review of the Dutch Grand Prix. Be sure to let us know your thoughts on the race down in those comments, and while you're there, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and like the video if you've enjoyed it. And Cass, speaking of that eventful first lap, what caught your eye?
Going into this race, knowing that the track was so narrow and that the only real overtaking opportunity would be on that very first corner, I was honestly expecting a collision, but nothing happened really. He had a few positions getting gained. Max took off like a rocket, but overall, it was actually pretty tame in comparison to what I was expecting.
The most things you saw was Gio falling back a few places and the two Alpines getting pretty close to each other.
Honestly, I think Alonso's IndyCar experience came well into play as you just saw him really taking advantage of that high line, making moves where it counts.
By the end of the first lap, Max already had a 1.6 second lead on the two Mercedes, but those three were kind of in a league of their own. It's another one of those tracks where the laps are super short, and we already had our first blue flag at lap 8, so a lot of traffic would come into play.
Once again, as with so many other races that we have seen this season, it really comes down to pit stop strategy. Right away, Mercedes pretty much made it clear that they were going to go for a two-stopper with Lewis, and Max and Red Bull's job was basically just to react.
And his job was made easier because Lewis had a very slow pit stop, coming in around 3.6 seconds, whereas Max had 2.7 seconds. He practically gained a full second on Hamilton in the pits alone.
Meanwhile, Valtteri was simply left out there to go long, and his job in the end would just be to attempt to defend against Max for as long as he could so that Lewis could close the gap. I think Valtteri tried pretty hard to make this happen. Ultimately, though, his tires were basically dead, so Max got by, and then immediately Valtteri just left the door open for Lewis to squeeze on past and continue the cat and mouse game.
And they were really close at this point, roughly all within a second of each other, so you thought this was going to be the moment that the race got decided.
Nope. None of the sorts. Max just kept on speeding ahead. At one point, it really did look like Lewis was closing the gap more and more, but then when Max received the radio message to his team notifying him of the gap, he basically just decided to speed up, and that was the end of that.
So aside from our fight for first place, the only other main driver movement in the field was with Perez. He was making a lot of gains after starting from the pit lane, and what was really interesting was that these moves weren't being all done at turn 1. So I was really intrigued to see where he would end up at the end of this race. But that covers the first half. And how would you score it, Cass?
I'll be short and sweet here. I scored it 4s across the board. I think the track itself looks amazing, but when there's no real opportunities for wheel-to-wheel battle, which Sergio would disagree with, but the rest of the grid did not. There wasn't anything overly dramatic aside from the pit stops between Max and Lewis, but even then, low-level drama. There wasn't that much racing. There wasn't that much excitement, so yeah. Meaning my score for the first half comes at a 4.
Whereas on my side, I scored my excitement at a 6 just because of how close the fight for first place came once Valtteri was trying to defend from Max. I wasn't sure at this moment who was going to end up winning this race. On the racing front, I scored it a 5, which might be a little high, but I was just happy to see that moves were being done, not just at turn 1. So all the points pretty much came from there. And like you said, on the drama side, not all too much. I scored it only a 3. So when you put my scores together, it comes out to roughly a 4.6. We're going to round that down to a 4.5.
Getting right into that second half, it started out with a low point. Unfortunately, we saw Seb lose the rear and spin out. Luckily, Seb was able to keep going, but yeah, definitely not a highlight in this race.
Yeah, we didn't see all too much from the Aston Martins in this race. You had Lance stuck behind George for most of it, so pretty uneventful week for them.
We saw a lot more pit stops in the second half of the race, notably with Lando Norris finally coming in after a 41-lap first stint on the medium tire. His strategy was a little weird for this race, but ultimately it benefited him in the end. We ended up seeing him have more pace than Daniel, and this ultimately led to them having to do some team orders, get a little driver swap up in there. A shame for Daniel because he was running in the points until Lando basically was told to overtake him. I really hope that McLaren figure it out for Monza because this was a very messy weekend for them all around.
And now our attention shifts back over to the front runners who are on that 2-stop pit strategy. Once again, you have Lewis come in first and then Red Bull reacting. However, this time, the tire choices between the two teams is different. You had Lewis on the medium tires and Max on the hard tires, but there was still a total of 32 laps to go. At first, I'm thinking that Lewis is going to be able to catch up to Max while he gets those tires warmed up. However, it ends up being the inverse. He ends up pushing those mediums too hard, and he starts questioning if he's gonna have enough tire left to make it to the end of this race. A lot of people were questioning Mercedes' strategy in this race. Did they pit Hamilton a bit too early, or were they just waiting for a safety car to eventually come so then Lewis could get the jump on Max at the restart? Well, with Mercedes having two drivers towards the front, they could play around with the strategy here and experiment a bit.
As for Red Bull's second driver, he was still making his way through the field, finding himself in a very tight battle with Lando Norris. Saw a little bit of contact between the two. It was really nice seeing Sergio really getting his elbows out there. It's these type of battles and his ability to just overtake the majority of the grid when starting at the back that basically awarded him driver of the day.
But towards the end of this race, there were a few other wheel-to-wheel battles that we unfortunately didn't get to see. Aside from Perez making moves all the way up to P8, there was also Fernando Alonso's fight against Carlos Sainz.
The reason we didn't see this at the time is because we were all focused on that weird scenario for the fastest lap. Valtteri gets brought into the pits for seemingly precautionary measures, I guess. Everyone seems a little bit confused as to why he was brought in, including Valtteri himself. Valtteri heads back out and he's setting purple sectors across the board. All of a sudden, the infamous radio message, "Valtteri, it's James. Abort your fastest lap." Ultimately, it's a little too late because he crosses the line and gets the fastest lap, stealing it back from Lewis.
The whole situation was pretty comical, and in the end, you had Lewis radio into the team saying, "I need that fastest lap point." He comes in and sets the fastest lap on the last lap of the race. And so there you have it. That's the end of the Dutch Grand Prix. Max wins. The entire track is engulfed in orange smoke. He wins on home soil for the first time. But we end off this race with the same top three that we started with.
And with that, Max regains the lead of the World Championship, and Ferrari are able to make the jump on McLaren for third place in the Constructors' Championship.
So now when it comes time to scoring the second half, Cass, what'd you give it?
I had my excitement at a 5 because it was a little bit better than the first half. You had a little bit more strategy coming into play, some weird stuff going on in the pits, last minute decisions. Racing, however, still had it at a 4 just because it was only Perez. There was apparently some stuff from Alonso and Carlos, but we just did not get to see it. And then drama I also boosted to a 5 just because of that very strange fastest lap scenario going on. Meanwhile, Max is just out in the front being calm. So when putting my scores together, it comes out to a 4.6. I'm gonna bump that down to a 4.5.
On my side, I brought my excitement down to a 5, as it seemed in the second half it was a lot more obvious who was going to win the race. In terms of the racing, I did score it a 6. I was quite happy with the number of overtakes I was seeing, especially that wasn't just from Perez. You also had Alonso in it, and we had some pretty close wheel-to-wheel action. And in terms of the drama, I scored that up just because of those incidents you mentioned. The radio message was very comical, like we said. We were questioning whether Valtteri was going to keep pushing for the fastest lap or eventually listen to team orders, and it was funny that it ended up him listening to team orders, but still setting the fastest lap. So when you combine all of my scores together, it comes out to roughly a 5.6. I'm going to round that down to a 5.5. So when you combine both of our scores together, the Dutch Grand Prix of 2021 comes out to a 4.6. We're going to round that down to a 4.5. Here's how the race compares to the other races so far this season. Be sure to let us know your thoughts on the race down in those comments. We are going back now to Monza. You won't want to miss that race review, so be sure to hit that subscribe button, like the video if you haven't done so already, and we will catch you in our next video.
Bye.